Welcome to Gramercy Book Club. Andrew Welsh-Huggins has really led a great conversation about your wonderful novel, How She Disappeared. The groups discussed your, memorable characters, and particularly there was a lot of talk about Frankie and how relatable she was and how she fills a yearning that we all have to solve cases involving missing children, and your storyline and the pace. So it was a great discussion. And I just want to remind everyone, Lisa is the #1 New York Times bestselling author of 20 suspense novels, including The Neighbor, which won the Thriller of the Year from the International Thriller Writers and the Silver Bullet Award from the International Thriller Writers in 2017 for her work on behalf of at-risk children and the Humane Society. That's so wonderful, Lisa. Tonight, your extraordinary moderator is Andrew Welsh-Huggins, and he's going to be asking you questions from the participants as well as his own during this portion of the book club. Everyone is now muted, and their questions are going to come through the chat box. So you and Andrew can now begin your conversation. Andrew?
Thanks, Linda. Hi, Lisa. Welcome.
Hi, Andrew. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for writing such a great book. I wanted to start. So many people are interested in Frankie, and you wrote in the acknowledgments that it was a BBC article about missing person sleuth Lisa Yellowbird Chase that inspired you to research the character that turned into Frankie. So I'm really curious, after all the fictional law enforcement investigators that you've created, what drew you to this kind of character who, although she works with law enforcement people, she herself is sort of totally outside of the criminal justice system?
Yeah, so when I read this article about Lisa Yellowbird Chase, most of my novels have been based on a crime. So it was really inspiring to base something on a crime solver. And just this notion of an everyday person, like you, Andrew, sitting at home and reading just one too many cases of a missing person going, that's it, I'm gonna do something about it. It struck me. And in the interview, the things she's talking about, the families don't love her because she's asking questions that many times they don't want answered. Law enforcement doesn't love her. They don't want, a lay person investing in a police investigation. I mean, she does it for the victims because she feels that strongly and that powerfully. But it also does lead to this question, who would turn their life upside down to do something like this? And I kind of wrote the whole book just to try to answer that question. Who is Frankie Elkin and why the hell is she doing this?
Let's talk a little more about that. So you excel at multi-viewpoint, multi-character narratives where a novel is told by many people involved in many of the characters, chapter by chapter, often a different viewpoint. It might be first person for one character and third in another. Here, you chose a traditional first-person narrative where everything we learn is solely through Frankie's eyes. And I'm really curious, why did you decide to take that route with this book, which in some ways reads almost like more of a traditional PI novel? And what were the challenges for you in that versus that multi-character process?
I never really think through these kinds of things like structure. You think I would? I've been at this for 30 years. I don't know. I can't even really tell you like why I find her as Flora Dane in first person, because she is. That's just how it came to me. But this book, because it really is a character piece driven by a crime, because that's really how she's trying to find herself, is through this crime solving. It just felt to me that it was always Frankie's story. And I will confess, I cursed myself for that many, many times. Changing points of view as a writer is refreshing, easier, I don't know. I found it actually extremely difficult. This is the entirely first person novel I've ever written. And I was sorry I came up with that as a concept.
Will give us a clue as to what comes in the future. I thought it worked really well. Now, one thing that we've all been interested in, I know I was interested in, was you create in this book a very realistic portrayal of a white woman who injects herself into a minority community. And, in lesser hands, that could be risky and in what are very race conscious times. Can you talk a little bit about why you followed that angle, what you did to write this so sensitively, and do you ever employ like sensitivity readers for something like this?
My publisher absolutely did employ a sensitivity reader. It was my first time working with one, and I was really grateful. And some of the perspectives I got from her were great. In fact, she was Haitian as well, which was another layer of proofing and reading for authenticity that I appreciated. What I really wanted in the construct of Frankie was an outsider, someone who would always feel marginalized and just never really at home. I think where we are in publishing right now, what made sense to me is Frankie had to be white because I'm white. And that's really, I can't presume to tell someone else's story. But I like the contrast with that, and really talking to people and friends. Anytime you are a minority in the room, being a female sometimes in a room with all men, or vice versa, you get that self-consciousness. And some people go through their entire life feeling that way. Frankie, it's episodic based on what she's doing. But I was really kind of going after that, again, that feeling of just, she's very solitary, and she's very aware that this is what her choices have meant for her. She is going through life alone.
Yeah, thank you. I should just explain very briefly that the phrase sensitivity reader refers to basically showing your work in progress to someone who may be coming from a community that's different from you. And it could be a person of color, it could be someone from the LGBTQ community, where you want to make sure that you're getting this right. I've done this myself, and I think it's very, very appropriate to do. We can't just write off the seat of our pants anymore about these issues.
Well, so here's a good
some
example. Oh, sorry, just a really quick example. I
Please
have a
do.
tendency, talking about my Haitian characters. I think there's twice I talked about they paled, like with shock. The sensitivity reader was like, that's not how that works. It's like, I am falling back on a cliche. Someone is frightened, they pale. She's like, you're gonna have to show frightened in a different way. It's like, well said.
Yeah, that's a great example. Couple people have process questions about when you started this story. Did you know the ending? And a kind of related question is the old pantser versus plotter question. How much of this, or frankly any of your books, did you have either on paper or in your head before you started, versus sort of letting the mystery take you where it would?
I started off plotting because in the very beginning, if I didn't know what was going to happen next, I was like too terrified to look at the computer. And then I don't know where you are with this process, Andrew, because this is actually my favorite question to take a poll among writers with. But I became a firmly entrenched pantser, which is to say I have no idea what I'm writing. So in the case of Before She Disappeared, I not only didn't know who did it, but I actually didn't know how Angelique disappeared. I had thought my issue would be finding her by the time I was done with the police and all the cameras and the witnesses, and they could track this and they could track that. I realized I didn't even know how she could ever possibly disappeared. And I wrote 200 pages just praying the answer to that would one day just appear. Pantsing is not for the faint of heart, Jakes. What do you do?
Yeah, I basically, I don't put anything on paper ahead of time. I tend to plot in my head a lot. I find that once it goes on paper, the whole thing sort of dies for me. So I tend to have good ideas, but it's always up here, so it's subject to change, as you've said. Yeah, I like that idea that you didn't know. I mean, I thought the resolution and the crime at the heart of this, I thought was just brilliant. It made absolute perfect sense, but you just couldn't have thought of it ahead of time. Now, somebody asks, did you enjoy creating a character who was an addict for the audience to learn about as we get pulled into her life, and it made it so difficult to put down? What was that process like for you? And you create a very realistic picture of Frankie as an addict and her struggles in that realm.
One of my real goals when I started thinking of Frankie is I knew she was an addict because of the obsessive streak in her. And in many ways, you can argue what she really is now is a dry drunk. She's taken the obsessiveness and self-destructiveness of her addict personality and, focused them on finding missing persons and highly dangerous situations. And then my other thought was just so often in fiction, we do deal with alcohol and alcoholism. You get everything from the heavy drinking noir detective that's always swilling whiskey to the burnt out cops who end all the night at the bars. And, sometimes we even talk about characters being alcoholic, but it feels like it's a trope. It's almost just kind of a generic description, and very few books really take on what does it mean. And so I really thought when I set out to write this book, Frankie's everyday. She's us, which means I have to make her authentic to us. So how does an everyday normal person truly wrestle with their alcoholism and not some, construct of a detective?
One thing that I mentioned in our discussion, and I'm curious your thoughts on this, that I found myself thinking of Frankie as she shares some traits in common with everybody's favorite drifter, Jack Reacher. But unlike Reacher, she is not invincible. And if she encounters danger, there's a real chance she's not going to be able to get out of it. She could be physically harmed. She uses her wits to escape problems. But yet she has this very, I drift from town to town. This is what I do. I move from town to town with basically no belongings, and I find missing people. And, I'm curious how you pictured her doing that and, and creating this, drifting loner that way.
I think really what Lee Child and I are both doing is kind of paying a homage to the Westerns. Both of us are going back to that archetype of the lone gunman that goes from town to town. One reviewer even called Frankie Jack Reacher with the gift of gab, which is pretty funny. But again, when I set out to think about who Frankie was, she's us. She's every day. So to have her suddenly have Marvel superhero powers or to become the kick-ass vigilante, I've kind of already written a hard-ass detective and a kick-ass vigilante. Again, Frankie's just, okay, tomorrow, Andrew, you and I are going to find a missing person. What are the questions we'd ask? Who we'd ask them of? If we got in trouble, how fast would we talk then to get back out of it? She's vulnerable. And I think that's part of her appeal.
Yeah. Just sort of following up on that, somebody wanted to know, who are some of your favorite authors that you read? You mentioned you were talking about Lee Child, but who do you read if you're, I don't know, on the beach or at the campground?
One of my favorite authors is Riley Sager. Survive the Night's going to be his new book, and I'm very excited. I can't wait. Greg Hurwitz with his Orphan X series I like very much. Karen Slaughter is one of my heroes, and Tess Gerritsen as well. Love Lisa Unger. Her Confessions on the 745 was one of my favorite books. Lisa Scottolini, Kristen Hanna. Love her historical book. She has a new one out right now, Four Feathers, about the Dust Bowl famine that I'm saving up like 2 days where I can't be interrupted. So I can just, these are the books that you're not just excited by, but you almost like hoard them like treasures. And I love to read, and I really will read any genre. I just want a character that grabs my attention.
Nice. You've created such, with Frankie and so many other characters, you have such strong female characters at the center of so many of the books. I think of one of my favorites, Flora Dane in When You See Me, who survived such a horrible experience to sort of take center stage there. Can you talk about, maybe it's an obvious question, but talk about your use of female characters and why that's important to you?
I'm blaming my grandmother for this. She's 101 years old. She's still with us. She is the family matriarch.
Fantastic.
We all do what grandma says. She crossed the country in the Great Depression. We lost 2 siblings along the way. They had to set up a couple farms, some went bankrupt, before she finally settled with my grandfather. And they actually ended up, there was a fun end of the story of selling the farm for over $1 million for them. But just everything she went through and how hard she worked. And I just took it for granted. Oh yeah, my favorite thing is she had a great garden that we as the grandkids were supposed to help pick and tend. And periodically you'd see her with a rifle over her shoulder, marching off to the garden. It'd be like, Grandma, she's like, go for problem. I'm like, okay, that will be resolved shortly, I see.
We just discovered a skunk in our backyard today. I don't know, does she travel at all or?
Not to say that my family's terribly redneck, but we totally are. I'm from Oregon, and we had the best time. My cousin got out all my grandfather's guns one day, and we're shooting at tin cans, and my grandmother could still outshoot us all. It was just amazing.
Fantastic. 101, that's wonderful. One thing I wanted to talk to you about was the way that you so successfully parcel out both backstory and clues and misdirections. A lot of us talked earlier about how at least I was very suspicious about the computer instructor up until the very end. And related to that, I've noticed in your books that you're just amazingly good at planting bad guys in plain sight early on. And then, I'll do one of these at the end. And I think Frederick Lagadou is a good example in this case. So I guess, could you talk about your process for doing that and maybe the rules you follow, especially when you do, like I said, you basically put the bad guy in plain sight early on. How do you pull that off?
So this is one of the reasons I'm a pantser. I feel like if I was plotting and I know who did it, I would broadcast it. So because I don't know who did it, my goal in the first 100 pages of any novel is to establish a pretty large cast of characters. And then my goal is that all of them are a little bit good and all of them are a little bit bad. So when it starts coming toward the end and I need to make a decision, because the bad guy should always be someone you've met in a book, or I think you're cheating. Everyone could go either way. And that makes it easier for me to finally figure out, often in the middle of the night, this is what 3 a.m. is for, but who actually did, who was in the parlor with the candlestick. But it's just starting with all sorts of possibilities and trying to get everything established in that first 100 pages. So also you're not cheating. You've met the characters.
Well, that's a good point. Yeah. Sometimes you'll encounter that bad guy for the first time on page 300 and it just doesn't seem right. And I mean, you've sort of touched on this, but as you're pantsing your way through, at what point do you say, oh, that's who it is? And then how much editing do you do in terms of going back? Do you do a full rewrite to put this person where he or she belongs?
So my process is 3 months research, 6 months drafting, 3 months revision work. And this is the bad news of pantsing. It has been the day before my deadline sometimes when I figured out who did it. And you're right, at that point, it's not cohesive. There's generally a few good reasons why, but you got to smooth it out. And insert a few better red herrings or kind of better adjust everyone's characterization. So the ending definitely does make sense. So I definitely get to edit. It's been 30 some books and I still spend 3 months in revision work. It's a little, I have one learning curve. Nope.
Yeah, well, good writing is usually rewriting. When you're spending those 6 months on the writing and then the 3 months on revision, can you just share with us your process? Are you a morning person, evening? Do you have a particular place you always write? Do you have a word count and all that? How does that work for you?
So I'm a morning person. I like to write first thing, sometimes even before coffee and breakfast. Just get to the computer before I'm too, self-aware. Try to get some pages done right then take a break for breakfast, may go right back to the work. If I feel like stuck at all, going for a walk. I'm a big hiker. It's kind of how I problem solve novels, stuff like that. Then coming back to it in the early afternoon. You're right. I kind of have a page count for the week. So some days are going to be great. Some days are going to be not so great. And then kind of later afternoon, social media, contracts, email, all the other stuff that goes into being published in 30 some countries.
Yeah, wonderful. Let's talk about place a little bit. You give us a really great sense both of Boston and did you say Mattapan?
Mattapan.
Mattapan. And you've set books in Georgia and Oregon. I think if I understand this, where the town, a thinly disguised version of the town where your grandparents lived. Is that right?
Yep. Tillamook. It's a thinly disguised version of Tillamook.
Yeah. So, when you're starting out, what's your decision-making process in terms of figuring out where a book is going to be set? And then can you talk about how you research and then provide such a strong sense of place regardless of where it is?
So I've spent half my life on the West Coast and half my life on the East Coast. So that's kind of the comfort zones, is Oregon or Boston. So you'll notice most of the books kind of fall along those two lines. I ended up with the Georgia books because there's special particularities for the crime or the crime solving that dictated they had to be there. For When You See Me, it was because that's kind of where we last knew Jacob Ness might have a place. So it had to be Georgia. I like to really explore and know and have firsthand experience with the places I'm going to write, because I feel like otherwise you're just describing visually versus, I don't know, a place can be like a character in and of itself, with its own flaws and strengths. And I'm kind of trying to master those complexities. In the case of Before She Disappeared, I knew I needed a community. And Mattapan kind of met all the boxes. It has a reputation for violence if you live in Boston. It is in real life nicknamed Murder Pan. But it also has this really rich Haitian culture. And that was very exciting for me. I mean, just the dynamics, how protective they are, a family. It was just everything I wanted. So I spent some time walking Mattapan because I didn't really know it. And I had a lot of people say you shouldn't be walking the streets in Mattapan. I went with a friend in the daytime and we had a really wonderful experience and met some just really, really nice people. So.
Now, to follow up on that, you could have created a Haitian neighborhood in Boston called, Marzipan. Talk about putting it in a totally identifiable place, and also so many great references to restaurants and places that are real. What's your rule or your philosophy when you set scenes and people in real places?
I often fictionalize locations if I'm going to do bad things with public officials. I don't want, someone thinking later that, or, there's town corruption. So like When You See Me, I fictionalized that town because the town was corrupt and I didn't want to, or some cute, quaint mountain town of that kind of thing. And I think that's how I ended up with Bakersville in Oregon, because I did a school shooting was how I started. And I didn't want a real school. That seemed inappropriate. So that fictionalization. If you can use a real place, I do prefer that. And I think particularly when you're doing cities, people want the grittiness, they want the reality, the authenticity of it.
Yeah, somebody told me once it's always a good idea to use real places, but until you have to put a body in the bar, and then it's probably not as good an idea.
I'm sorry. Ahead. So just like the school and Before You See Me as fictionalized, because I'm talking about how to get out and and I thought maybe I shouldn't do that to a real school.
Somebody wants to know, did you actually taste the meat pies in that bakery you described?
I really miss travel in the pandemic. I love to travel. I love to eat food. I'll eat pretty much anything. And in all my years, I've never had Haitian food. It's like, what was wrong with me? So I did a lot of research before going to Mattapan. And it's like, you have to stop at these places and eat this food. And all of it was good, but the meat pies were to die for. I still can't, it's like a sweet spicy. I'm not gifted enough to know what those spices are, but I want to go back. I'm desperate to go back.
Yeah.
And I read, people would come for the weekend and buy like dozens of them to take home. It's like, I get it now. Totally makes sense to me.
Yeah, we're all heading there once this is all over. When you were walking those streets, or when you research other places, how much was Frankie in your head as you were walking, or was she as you're on these streets where you think she's going to be in your book?
It's easy to have Frankie in my head because Frankie is a stand-in for us. So, like when I write Flora Dane, who's a vigilante, if I'm trying to do a location with her, I have to try to replicate her hyper vigilance, which is part of her PTSD. And you're looking at everything from kind of like that safety point of view and egresses. And but Frankie's she's a rolling stone. She's not looking for trouble. She's trying to have decent street smarts, but again, she's not promising to have any great skills. What I loved is that we can be a proxy for her. So, she read about Mattapan and it's, bad inner city neighborhood, don't go, don't go, don't go. And then walking it, you discover a lot of really lovely areas, really nice people, really great restaurants. And, that's she's having the hands-on experience so that we can have it.
Now, sort of as we wrap up, Frankie is she's wrestling with two significant bits of baggage, at least to my mind, through the book. And one is what happened to Paul. And you parcel that out marvelously, so we don't really get the gist of that until near the end, as we should. But the other thing is that she's very upfront with the fact that she's very good at finding missing people, but she's never found someone alive. And that weighs heavily on her as she's searching for Angelique. And she seems to conquer both these demons, obviously, at the end. And so I'm curious, when you were finished with her, what kind of, did you have an inclination that she had settled fought those demons and was ready to ground herself someplace, that her wandering was over?
I don't think those demons are why she wanders. I think her wandering is somewhat organic. Like she's just that restless personality type. I think it's also her addiction. Again, I think if she stayed in one place, if she had normalcy day after day after day, for her, that would drive her to drink. That's her trigger. I did kind of start a second book with her. So apparently my standalone is now the start of a series and I need like a 12-step program. I think there's a lot more for her to do and a lot more of these kinds of situations of places that are under-resourced. So in her next book, she's taking on all the missing in the national public lands. Again, one of the things people don't necessarily know a lot about is we don't even have a centralized database for how many people go missing in parks or hiking or just like national forests. It's not tracked. In some cases, it's not even clear who the jurisdiction is. Search parties, by and large, are volunteers. When they're done, they have to go back to real life and the family's just left. And just to be ironic, the biggest source of data is the North American Bigfoot Foundation because they track anomalies. So they actually have the best map of missing people in the United States. So again, it's these kind of really kind of esoteric things. So I'm sending Frankie into the national public lands to bring home a body, actually. And this time she knows they won't, it's been too long. But the missing hiker's mom is dying of cancer and she wants to be buried next to her son. And these are some of the really real world situations that handle without getting the body, you have no closure.
I mean, missing people, or whether they're long time missing or, they've vanished in a brief sense, that has sort of dominated a number of your books. What is it about that trope that you think is so powerful, and why do you, pursue that?
I think it's I've been reading a lot of books on the subject. I'm researching this next book, and someone talked about one of the families that it's a double tragedy because something terrible has happened, but you don't know what happened. So they're like, we can't even limit our spinning mind late at night. You have to imagine everything because you have that many unanswered questions. And it just takes a particular toll on people. I guess it's my biggest fear. I like closure. I like tangibility. And that abyss, that limbo of your loved one vanishing and just having no answers, not knowing, I think is just one of the worst things. That's my fear. So now it's yours. Huh.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Finally, you've more or less answered this. This was a great topic in the chat, but a big question was, now that you got Frankie to where she is, will she come back? And it sounds like she will be coming back. And that's definitely good news. Do you see adding her to your stable of recurring characters for multiple books, or is it hard to sort of think that far ahead?
I never plan ahead, but I think past behavior is the best indicator of future acts. I can't seem to let any of my characters go. And one of the ways I deal with that is to pile them all into a book so I can visit them all at once, like a family reunion. So I would say the odds are high, but when, I can't tell you. But I would be surprised if it didn't happen.
Wonderful. Well, Lisa, I'd like to thank you so much for spending some time with us tonight and talking about Before She Disappeared. Really, really enjoyable book. Glad to know we'll be hearing from Frankie again. I'd like to thank everybody for such great questions and for being here tonight. I'm going to turn it back to Linda and just remind everybody that, of course, Before She Disappeared is available at Gramercy Books if you're in Columbus, and it's also available at Gramercy Books if you aren't, and you can order it online. So again, Lisa.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, Gramercy Books, and thank all of you for coming and participating tonight.
And I wanted to add my thanks, Lisa and Andrew. What a great conversation. And I have to say, you know, this format is fun for us, this book club format that we do. With the discussion, clearly we're bringing together a lot of people that really love your work. And we were seeing that all throughout the chat box too, that there's some people here who have read every single book that you've written. So, you know, thank you for sharing yourself with us and your process. And Andrew, wonderful questions. Thank you so much for how you navigated just the different characters and setting and parts of the book. It was a wonderful, wonderful evening.